Throughout the course of the semester in behavioral finance, we've discussed and reviewed various articles and a few videos on financial and non-financial incentives. This is one of the major topics across behavioral finance and various different psychological analysis throughout the economy. A very important topic that is focused on in just about every single organization, company on a daily basis. Since it's such an important topic, I figured I would write this paper on it. I realized that obviously there are endless studies to this since it is such a widely looked at topic. So I tried to narrow it down and I found a few different studies on this. So first of all, when considering providing incentives to increase performance, people typically think of offering financial incentives first. That's the first thing they jump to because what better way to motivate people than money? So when watching one of the videos that we looked at in class, it was posted during week 9. 2 studies were brought to light that focused on giving people tasks to do and providing them with monetary rewards based on performance. The first study was conducted here in the United States. It provided the worst performers with small monetary compensation, middle performers with a fair and decent amount of monetary reward, and high performers with a large cash prize. The study found that tasks involving purely mechanical skills resulted in incentives working as expected when offered higher compensation for performing better. People did perform better. When it came to tasks involving rudimentary cognitive skills, in fact, it was found that higher pay actually led to worse performance, which is obviously very interesting. Then, because of this, they attempted the same study in Madurai, India, because of the different economics. So essentially the monetary reward would mean more to these people in rural India than people here in the United States. So they offered low performers a few days worth of compensation, medium performers a month of compensation, and top performers 2 months of what they would normally make. Interestingly, they found that the results were no different. So personally, being someone that never looked into research on incentives before, I found this very interesting, extremely surprising. I think that most people would tend to think that offering these people in an impoverished rural area of India giving them 1 to 2 months of their salary would lead to immensely increased performance, but shockingly it didn't. This led me to question what exactly about involving cognitive skills in these tasks deterred people from performing higher when it comes to obtaining a higher reward. Next, looking at an article from class, it highlighted some of the major risks involved with financial incentives. The first risk was the impact of financial incentives on ethics and ethical behavior. The second had to do with an increase in pay inequality when financial incentives were offered, and the third had to do with a reduction in intrinsic motivation. All 3 of these factors were found to be major hindrances to performance in the workplace, not necessarily because of direct impact it had on employees and their work, but indirect factors such as employee behavior and their morale when working in the workplace. So first, looking at ethics, when provided financial incentives, it was found that overwhelmingly people are more likely to be involved in and partake in unethical behavior in order to reach these financial incentives that they may not be able to reach otherwise. Next, looking at pay inequality. When giving financial incentives to employees, it was found that employees who didn't achieve these financial incentives, obviously they were being compensated less, and because of this, it demoralized them and made them feel overlooked as employees, which obviously you don't want in the workplace because that creates a discrepancy between employees that may be doing the same exact work, but one may be performing higher. It was actually found that in a study conducted on Major League Baseball teams that those with higher pay inequalities performed less or performed worse. They hit less home runs, they scored less, and they allowed more runs to opposing teams than those with smaller gaps in pay who were more equally distributed amongst players, which I found to be quite interesting. Next, looking at intrinsic motivation. This was something that was kind of touched on in the video mentioned earlier in this video that we looked at in class. Intrinsic motivation is kind of how people motivate themselves. So internal motivation, it convinces people essentially what to do, how to do it, why they're doing something. And in analyzing this, there were 3 things that were found to motivate people when it came to intrinsic motivation, and those were mastery, purpose, and autonomy. When it comes to mastery, people obviously want to feel like they are getting better at something, they're perfecting a skill, which is very important to workers and people all over the world. One of the examples used was just playing musical instruments. Yes, it might not be directly involved in accounting if you're an accountant, but it is something people strive to master tasks and skills. Next, looking at purpose, people obviously want to feel as though they're making a difference. They want to have some type of bigger picture and bigger purpose behind their work so that it feels like they're working towards something so that they can benefit others as well as themselves and leave the world with something lasting. Third, looking at autonomy, people want to feel as though they're self-regulated. In the video, it talked about how a company in Australia gave their workers a 24-hour period every quarter to simply work on whatever they wanted with whomever they wanted. And the only stipulation was that at the end of the 24-hour period, they needed to present to management what they had done in this 24-hour period. And this was found to have led to various software debugs and lots of other helpful and useful things that either help the organization or help society as a whole. Lastly, there are 2 other studies that bring to light and discuss more of the non-monetary incentive side of things, which was briefly discussed within the video, talking about purpose, mastery, and autonomy. The first study took a look at the effect of non-financial incentives on small and medium-sized businesses in the U.S. The study found that job enrichment, internal pay, equity, managerial skills, and employee recognition all yielded significant results when tested. This goes to reaffirm incentives other than those tied to financials are certainly able to produce results, allow employees to be more productive and perform at a higher rate. So it's not necessary that companies, firms have to rely solely on financial incentives, which may not work and which may lead to unethical behavior and some of the other risks as mentioned before. The second study I looked at was conducted on non-financial incentives on bricklayers and their productivity in Nigeria. In the course of this study, randomly selected construction firms of varying size were given questionnaires. So they had small, medium, large firms. Questionnaires were comprised of 3 categories of questions regarding non-financial incentives, questions asked three things: the level of popularity of non-financial incentives versus financial incentives at these firms, the level of management involvement in employee work and in incentive schemes, and finally, the premium placed on certain identified variables of non-financial incentives. And it was found that non-financial incentives were the preferred method for motivation for employees. Secondly, it was found that premiums placed on variables of non-financial incentives decreased from large firms to small firms, and that small firms were more likely to implement these forms of motivation rather than monetary rewards, which in a way makes sense because smaller firms may not have the capital to provide these financial incentives, but also at smaller firms, the employees and management are working more closely with each other. It is more likely that they develop a personal rapport and that these non-financial incentives do mean more to these employees. Lastly, it was found that the non-financial incentive schemes were responsible for between 6 and 26% of increased output on bricklaying activities on site. So this kind of is direct proof of non-monetary incentives and rewards working and helping productivity and performance. With that said, it is clear that non-financial incentives are certainly a good alternative to financial incentives. Not to say that financial incentives can't be used correctly and implemented in order to increase performance, but as mentioned, there are risks in doing that, leading to unethical behavior, pay inequality, and that sort of thing. So when companies are deciding how to incentivize employees, they should not necessarily overlook non-monetary incentives and not jump straight to looking at financial incentives. Thank you.